My name is William Joseph Cobble, author of the ongoing Continuing with Paul book series. This is an excerpt from chapter 1 in the first book in the series, Continuing with Paul, the hidden story behind the writing of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Paul's final journey to Jerusalem and his final interaction with James is reported in Acts 21. It is on this journey that Paul brought the money raised for the Jerusalem poor from his Gentile churches. He may have considered the collection as much a gesture of bridge building as charitable giving, allowing him to show that he was still a team player before traveling on to Spain. Paul wrote of his intentions in his letter to the Roman church, quote, "At present, however, I am going to Jerusalem in a ministry to the saints, for Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to share their resources with the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. They are pleased to do this, and indeed they owe it to them, for if the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual blessings, they ought also to be of service to them in material things. So when I have completed this and have delivered to them what has been collected, I will set out by way of you to Spain." Romans chapter 15, verses 25 through 28. It should be noted that this collection involves systematic sacrificial giving by the individual members of Paul's churches. Quote, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, you should follow the directions I gave the churches of Galatia. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put aside and save whatever extra you earn, so that collections need not be taken when I come." 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. 2 Corinthians 8 shows Paul adamantly pushing his congregation to, quote, "complete this generous undertaking among you that they had begun last year." This shows that the money was being collected over a long period of time. Of interest is Paul's awareness that Jerusalem could be a dangerous place for him to return to. Quote, "To join me in earnest prayer to God on my behalf, that I may be rescued from the unbelievers in Judea, and that my ministry to Jerusalem may be acceptable to the saints." Romans 15, verses 30 through 31. In this passage, Paul reveals that the additional concern that his collection might not be acceptable to the Jerusalem mother church. One interpretation of this is that Paul is worried the amount of his collection will not be sufficient to meet the needs of the Jerusalem poor. This understanding, however, does not comfortably fit the Greek word from which acceptable is translated. As Paul uses it in both Romans and 2 Corinthians, the word may also be translated as well received, pleasing, or welcome. This makes Paul's concern seem less about the amount of the collection being sufficient and more about his hope that the collection will be accepted by the Jerusalem leaders when he presents it. In Acts 20, verse 22, Paul says the following, quote, "I am on my way to Jerusalem, not knowing what will happen to me there, except that the Holy Spirit testifies to me in every city that imprisonment and persecutions are waiting for me." Such concerns would explain why Paul would call for earnest prayer for his own protection. It is not known, however, why he believed his collection for the Jerusalem poor might be rejected. Luke writes that when Paul arrived in Jerusalem on his final visit, he was welcomed warmly by the brothers. The next day he went to visit James and, quote, "all the elders were present." Paul relayed that, quote, God had done what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry, and the elders praised God. But it's after delivering this progress report that Paul received the accusation, which Luke attributes to, quote, "they said," but the reader may presume was given by James, speaking as leader of the group. Quote, "You see, brother, how many thousands of believers there are among the Jews, and they are zealous for the law. They have been told about you that you teach all the Jews living among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, and that you tell them not to circumcise their children or observe the customs." Verses 20 through 21. It should be noted that Acts does not record a response by Paul to this accusation. There is no confirmation nor rebuttal, but perhaps the statement required no response if both James and Paul already knew the answer. It has already been shown that Paul did not expect Barnabas and Peter to, quote, "act like Jews" in the church at Antioch, and the fallout of that incident would have undoubtedly been relayed to the Jerusalem mother church. Paul's letters were also in circulation. James asked, "What is to be done?" "They will certainly hear that you have come, so do what we tell you." Verses 22 and 23. James believes the accusations against Paul warrant some kind of public relations response, possibly because Paul's presence could reflect negatively upon the Jerusalem leaders if left unchecked. James' proposed solution is for Paul to go through, quote, the rite of purification, which is temporary Nazarite vows, with four of the church's men. This would involve paying for the 7-day rite involving grain and animal sacrifices based on number 6 that ends with the head being shaved and the hair burned. This would be an expensive undertaking. It was not uncommon at this time for wealthy patrons to sponsor a single person who was completing the vow but lacked funds. Where would Paul have gotten the money to sponsor himself plus 4 others? If James was expecting Paul to use the funds collected from his churches, this could have amounted to a subtle rejection of the collection. Had the public outcries against Paul prevented James from being able to accept the gift from the Gentile churches? Did James think the money for the poor would be better invested in clearing Paul's scandalized reputation? Such things could only be speculated, but there's a good reason for thinking along these lines. Contending with Paul.